We're going to go ahead and get started. Our last presenter for the day is Carolee Hubbard. She's a retired FedEx mechanic. She's been teaching here for 2 or 3 years now.
Well, since 2002 on and
Oh,
off.
well, okay.
Full-time,
That's
yeah.
2 or 3 years, yeah. So anyway, she's got some tips for maintaining our airplanes if we're not flying them, and then treating them okay if we are flying them, and hopefully treating ourselves okay. So over to you.
Thank you, Rocky. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today, I should say. And I won't keep you too long, because I know you're probably attention span's about done by now. But it has been a great day. We've learned a lot following everybody's presentations. The main words we want to know is that we're going to live by is communication and preparedness. I think are kind of 2 big takeaways from today. We'll sum up on that later. But when we're talking about flying in most parts of the United States, especially Alaska, where it's winter longer than it's not, I mean, pretty much given there, it can adversely affect your flight operations. Poor weather conditions, compiled with fast-moving fronts, strong and gusty winds, blowing and drifting snow, freezing rain, ice fog, reduced visibility, icing conditions, albedo effect. I was in Paul Herrick's class, one of my first semesters here at this school, and called it libido effect. Of course, they'll start laughing at me. We were talking about the crash into Mount Erebus, into a controlled flight there, into terrain. So that's never what you want, but that can happen. Of course, you could be down Alaska and experience it too. Vertigo, sense of falling, not knowing which way is up or down based on that horizon. But anyways, we're going to talk a little bit more about what it's like to operate in the wintertime, being a flight line mechanic, and loving to have off my summers with my husband who's sitting over there in the corner, my gate mate. He's a tiger. We both went to school here. He went here in the 70s, I went in the 90s. And yeah, a big part of our day was making sure we were prepared, because we had to have those airplanes out ready for the pilots who were going to take care of them, or take them on to their other routes. If we didn't take care of them, then nobody was, so that was our job. And operation in this environment requires special winter operating procedures, whether you're on heavies or you're on Cessna 150s, it's all the same. This following and final presentation for today touches on the guidelines of winter flying preparedness. So a big part of my day was spent right there on that gate. Back in the day, we were up in the bucket, but fortunately, they farmed that out to IDS later on. But, you know, in the land of the giants, or the heavy side of the airport, the pilots rely on the technicians to make sure their airplane is warmed up and ready to go for them. For extended layovers, technicians were required to inspect and inspect again for snow and ice buildup. The pre-de-ice that aircraft, run those engines, move the flight controls, check all system servicing levels, and check for proper operation of the systems. And it was recommended to connect a ground heater if your outside air temperature is less than 38 degrees and your ground time was greater than 2.5 hours. And this step established a good relationship to start with your crew members. And it was, because we had to look at it as like their office. You know, it's their office, and remember, if the heater is working in your vehicle, that airplane should be warmed up and ready for them when they come outside. And that was kind of a big part of our day, keeping all of our equipment fueled up and those airplanes ready to go. You establish a means of communication. Again, that term going to keep coming up today. With the outbound flight crew, should they require assistance prior to departure while you're completing the fueling paperwork? I like to have a handheld VHF radio. Mark and I, we didn't leave the office without that. That was our key to talking to those crew members. That way they could bypass operations and speak right directly to us if there was a problem. You communicated your de-icing procedures with the flight crew, the ramp, and your de-ice coordinators. You always made it clear to the crew that the APU, your auxiliary power unit, on those aircraft were not to be started until that tail had been de-iced, or you risked foughting it out. And sometimes that de-icing process could be lengthy, especially when we turned it over to IDS. They didn't have the Trump truck with no regulation on how much fluid was being pumped out of there like when we operated them. So because of environmental reasoning, you don't want all that fluid going out, but because it takes a while, you're gonna oftentimes have to spray those flight control surfaces again. And one more picture, a couple more pictures of the heavies, and we'll get to the small ones. Okay, so remember, inspection of that exterior of that airplane is important. So is your engines. You always have to remember ice fog is a foe, okay? We get a lot of it here in Anchorage. Get down around that 15-degree mark, dew point's just right, you're gonna have that ice fog. And when it comes to your engine inlets, super crucial. That airplane taxis in, it collects that frost, it melts into a puddle at the bottom of the engine as it's sitting there on the ground, that refreezes. This can happen in a short ground turn. And presto, you have a clear ice sitting in the bottom of that engine and your blades are sitting right there. You go to spool it up and it's not gonna be good. Okay, so we always had to be very cognizant of that. You always had to inspect your landing gear, your engines, your wings, your fuselage, empennage, nose of that aircraft, looking from the front and back of those blades for damage or frost or clear ice. Because your winter ice checks are crucial. And it doesn't matter whether you're on a small plane or a big plane. Berto, he went to school here, went from Super Cubs to 747s in a day. Working on that end of Merrill out to Anchorage International, so I always love this airplane. Right, but we are seriously governed by the FARs when it comes to keeping those airplanes free of ice, okay? So it doesn't matter you're Part 121 or the small planes, Part 135 operators and 91, you're gonna have to all be in accordance with your FARs for keeping those airplanes clean. The clean aircraft concept. You're not going to take off with snow and ice on those wings, whether you're on a 747 or a Super DC-3. Okay, you need the reason why we have to have these winter ice checks is to prevent costly maintenance issues, ensure your aircraft are safe and reliable. You're ready to go. You can see a little bit of snow on that fuselage on that Transnorthern, but under Part 91, operate in icing conditions. No pilot may take off an aircraft that has frost, ice, or snow adhering to any propeller, windshield, stabilizing, or control surface. A little bit on his fuselage isn't going to hurt so much as at FedEx the rule was none. You could not have any snow or ice on any part of that aircraft before it left. Okay, but on these other smaller airplanes, sometimes that's not always the case. You can have a little bit up there on the fuselage. But extra precautions should always be used when we're talking about winter ops. This is Transnorthern Super DC-3 for those of you who don't know it. My former spouse brought this one up from Florida, and now it's not easy when you're operating these airplanes. They have to have the blankets put on them. You're the pilot, you have to do all the work. You're not spoiled like the guys flying the heavies, where we're going to have your airplane ready for you. The technicians have your airplane for you. When you are operating in winter conditions up here as a pilot, owner, operator, you're it. You are the person responsible for getting your airplane ready to go. Okay, because of this, it's imperative to be familiar with winter conditions in the particular area where you're leaving from and where you're going to. A distance of a few miles may change the environment enough to present new problems. There are certain precautions that are significant to winter flying. Flight planning during winter months will require special knowledge in order to protect the aircraft as well as the pilot. So extra precautions should be used. Those roads that you traveled that were during the summer months may not be there in the winter. To be forced down from civilization in the event of an emergency may create a serious problem, and it'll be a matter of life and death, survival. So with today's extensive highway system in most states, of course here in Alaska, they're just roads. We don't have interstates and freeways like they do in the lower 48, but following that highway can extend most of those flights in small aircraft for just a few minutes. So even the vehicles on the road, when you see them, they can give you valuable information. If there's snow and ice on them, have they collected that coming at you? These are all the kinds of signs you need to watch, and also the other pilot reports, as was mentioned earlier today. when Bart was talking, excellent presentation about teaching us about winter preparedness. Just kind of goes into all aspects of it. So we were flying in 180 back from Fairbanks, pardon me? Someone, no, I thought someone asked something. We were flying a 180 back from Fairbanks in the winter, stopped in Talkeetna for lunch one day, and coming into Lake Hood, that ceiling kept dropping. You know, we're along that, so sitting in the river, flying along the bottom of it, and it just wasn't good. I said, we've got to turn around, go back to Talkeetna. This isn't worth the risk. I don't want to spend the night down there in the riverbed. And we always had our survival gear with us. Like they were saying, put it on you. Carry most of it, whatever you can on you. But we ended up luckily making it back into Talkeetna that day, and took out one of the, he probably landed where he wasn't supposed to land, took out one of the lights, but we ended up no harm, no foul, we made it. But I know some of the tips, you know, sketchy at best, but some of the tips when you're thinking about winter flying, file that flight plan when applicable, in conjunction with your ELT, like that he was saying, and I recommend taking a sat phone. I don't think I would want to go anywhere without a sat phone, because of darn cell service up here, we all know how reliable that is. It's always good to have a backup plan. Preparedness and contingency planning is so important. And keep in mind, a little knowledge on winter survival may save your life. Okay? If you're not planning to file a flight plan, at least let people know, more than one person know where you're going and when your ETA for return is. And you keep those emergency comm devices that you take with you sufficiently charged up. Check in with people in the area where you're going when available, and experience has shown that the advice of operators who are located in the area where the operation is contemplated is invaluable. If you're going somewhere where you're not used to flying into, check with the people who are there. You guys all know that, you're pilots. Here I am giving you advice to things that you've already lived a lifetime of doing, right? So don't let compulsion take the place of good judgment is really the bottom line. Prior planning will prevent costly maintenance issues and ensures those aircraft are safe and reliable. And remember, compliance with your Code of Federal Regulations 91-527 when we're talking about operating in icing conditions. Now getting on to some of the mechanics of it. Minimizing corrosion risk is a good idea when we're talking about winter flying. Seal those openings, your vents, your fuel caps, etc. You can apply corrosion inhibitors to your metal parts. You can use desiccant plugs for your engine. If you're going to plan on not flying these airplanes, you want to take care of them to reduce the risk of what the harsh environment's going to hand to it. You know, it's sitting outside all winter long. That engine oil is extremely important to keep, you know. It's good to use an anti-rust additive in it. And of course, complying with your maintenance manual recommendations always, but you want to make sure you meet your mil specs. So this picture of this aviation anti-rust oil container, Phillips 66, meets the mil spec of mil spec C6529. So you can check that with Lycoming, Continental, whatever your engine manufacturers are, and also airframe manufacturers regulations. You never want to put something in there that's not recommended. Covers are good. Cover your aircraft with breathable, weather-resistant covers. Those can save you a lot of effort with your snow and ice removal. And then, of course, the engine plugs and little covers. Plugs and covers. So I guess you could call, sometimes they're referred to as cowl blocks, engine bungs, however you want to say it. But having those areas where weather can get into, keeping that weather out is probably one of your best tools against that shortening the life of your equipment. Okay, so basing your airplane in a dry climate, washing it often, placing your airplane in a hangar, and treating chip paint and keeping windows and doors tightly sealed is ideal, but not really feasible on a regular basis. We're not going to be washing our airplanes here. It's not like we can take them to the car wash like we do our cars, but unless you have a hangar. But if you can do any of these steps, then you're lucky. And I would like to recommend at least performing a corrosion inspection prior to purchasing. Or you may encounter what we did with that same 180 that we purchased out of Cordova in the 90s. Oh, it was a great deal, $40,000, came with a couple sets of floats. Evelyn and I had just gotten out of school. Guess what our first job was to do? Replace that landing gearbox. Good thing we'd had a good sheet metal instructor here, because that was not a fun task. But I highly recommend doing your corrosion inspections prior to purchase, because we got not only to learn how to replace that, but we learned exactly what intergranular corrosion looked like. Okay, and so there's a picture there on that bottom left. It's the Cessna gear brackets and the inboard angles that were manufactured originally on those used an extrusion process, which is geared for high volume, lower cost production. As that aluminum was extruded, the molecular structure of that material was altered, which made it more susceptible to developing that intergranular corrosion. So there's a picture of the P-Ponk upgraded, re-engineered inboard angle brackets for those Cessnas, whether 170, 180, and 185s. A lot of you probably already know about that, but you see these advertisements for these planes that says P-Ponk upgrade. Well, that's what they're talking about. Corrosion, so they make that a little more corrosion resistant as possible. Of course, picture on the right there. If you can afford a fancy hanger, more power to you. That's where I want mine kept. So anyway, but if your home base, like most people, is located outside, there are some risks that can be imposed by prolonged heating of your engines. You don't want to do that. You don't want to just leave a heater on them. You want to use a thermostatically controlled heater and heat it only before flight to minimize that moisture, because the more you heat it up, cool it down, heat it up, cool it down, the more you are susceptible it to moisture damage, okay? So that's the best thing is not to do that. So heat it before flight to minimize that moisture.
What's your thought on, Tanis is now saying the opposite. Tanis is saying don't unplug it. And you'll have no corrosion in.
Yeah, if you're running on a regular basis, but for people who are just flying once in a while, you know, once a month you're gonna go flying, you're not gonna leave it on heat continuously. But yeah, I was reading over some of that Tanis. Of course, some of their products they're pretty proud of, if you can afford them, but they do have the block heaters and the cabin heaters, and I was looking at, but yeah, I will look into that. Most of the information I pulled was out of an FAA circular for winter tips on flying. But there's so many things, you could go all over the place with trying to figure out battery charging, heaters, what are the best solutions. What are some of your thoughts on heaters? I know it's all over the place as far as what type of heaters. Any of you have something you really prefer for a method of heating for your fuselage and your engines? Ceramic heater, plug-in. I guess it's depending on what kind of power you have available. If you have electricity available, you're going to plug it in to electric heat, but if you don't, you're going to be subject to having to use propane or whatever fuel you have available, white gas. But the biggest thing is water. Water's your enemy. You don't want that in there, so moisture. Plan on how you want to preheat your engine. Some other tips: check your runway conditions, consider your weather changes, clean that frost off before you go. These are all just tips. Operation of aircraft into pre-flight inspection is important in temperature extremes, so it's natural to hurry over the pre-flight of an aircraft, but consider that time that you're going to do that pre-flight inspection. You want to consider also fuel contamination possibilities with moisture. Half-empty tanks in the cold, possibility of condensation, it's better to keep them full. Fueling facilities can also have problems in the wintertime, so checking that fuel, making sure it doesn't have water in it, it's all important, and contaminants. it says fill your tanks up as soon as possible after landing them. Drain the fuel sumps to remove any water which may have been introduced. Be sure that fuel is delivered. Be sure the fuel being delivered for your plane is clean. When we're talking about carburetor icing is another thing to think about. Okay, this chart came straight out of the FAA document. Different things when you consider about carburetor icing are 3 categories. Impact ice, formed by impact of moist air at temperatures between 15 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit on your air scoops, your throttle plates, your heat valves, etc. Usually forms when visible moisture such as rain, snow, sleet, or clouds are present. So your most rapid accumulation can be anticipated at about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel ice, it forms at and downstream of the point where fuel is introduced, and it occurs when the moisture content of the air freezes as a result of the cooling caused by vaporization. It generally occurs between 40 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but may occur at even higher temperatures. It can occur whenever the relative humidity is more than 50%. So when you're thinking about carburetor icing, it's not always what you assume it can be. It's just because it's not cold out doesn't mean you can't have it. Throttle ice forms at or nearly a partly closed throttle valve. So the water vapor in that induction of the air condenses and freezes due to the Venturi effect, cooling as the air passes through that throttle valve. Since the temperature drop is usually around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, the best temperatures for forming throttle ice would be about 32 to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. So in general, carburetor ice will form in temperatures between 32 and 50, but the thing to do is just know what to anticipate it, know what to do before it happens. So if you're partial throttle, cruise or let down, most crucial time for that carburetor ice. The recommended practice is to apply carburetor heat before reducing that power and to use partial power during letdown to prevent icing and overcooling that engine. And that's all, again, out of your winter tips from the FAA document. Use that carb heat on a ground check, use that heat in the icing range, and use heat on approach and descent. Warning signs of carb ice include loss of RPM when you're at fixed pitch, drop in manifold pressure at constant speed, and rough running. Pilot response to warning signs should be apply full carb heat immediately, and may run rough initially for a short time while that ice melts. And in the chart below, the curves and the curves are showing favorable conditions for carburetor icing. So when you receive that weather briefing, note that the temperature and dew point and consult with that chart. Also, you want to be cognizant of carbon monoxide poisoning. Another thing, there's just so many different things to consider when you're talking about winter flying. You want to have the little carbon monoxide detectors in your plane, whether it be the little cards or the plug-in types that they're now recommending. Highly, I would have both myself. That way you have some redundancy with it because it's a silent but deadly killer. Okay, of course, if you do encounter some of it, shut off that cabin heater, get some fresh air coming in there, and please put out that cigarette. So what about your batteries? Enough of that stuff. Batteries are kind of what I like to teach. Okay, store your batteries in a temperature-controlled environment. It's not always ideal to take your battery in and out of your airplane, especially when it's stuffed in the back behind a panel. Get your technician to do it, that's what we're for. Make them do the work. But if you are going to leave it in your plane, these sealed batteries that they have now, how many are still operating the old lead acid batteries where you have to check their specific gravity? Okay, those don't like cold, right? They don't like it at all. Most batteries don't. Look at our car batteries. How long do they usually last in a long winter? They don't like cold. It wrecks your state of charge. Let me just put it that way. But if you are going to leave it out there, keep it on a smart or a pulse charger. I know we've always said trickle chargers. My husband loves his trickle chargers, but you have to have it where it's not going to damage that battery when you've got that trickle charger plugged in. It's better off to go with a smart or pulse charger. They make solar ones by Pulse Tech. So that's one of Dr. Diane's favorite ones to use out there. They cost a little more, but they're handy in certain situations where you have a little bit of solar power available. But there is also the Battery Minder, which is another brand. It's a 3D mode charger that extends that performance and life of that battery without overcharging your battery. Okay, and there's a picture of the sealed battery. So most of those modern sealed batteries do stay in the aircraft, and they have to keep them regularly charged is the deal. If you're with the old lead acid batteries, you do need to, unsealed, you need to consider if you're operating in a colder climate, say coming from Fairbanks down to Anchorage, take into consideration your state of charge and your temperature corrections, straight out of 4313 in your manufacturer's recommendations. If you're sitting at -30 in Fairbanks and you're coming to Anchorage at +30, you have to subtract points from your specific gravity reading to make sure that you've got the correct reading for your what you want to have for your city level. So a fully charged battery will not freeze. When we're talking about adding water to those batteries in extremely cold weather, you need to charge it immediately, okay?
Could you put the previous slide on?
Oh, yes. There you go. So you want an example? Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
There you go, you're welcome. Okay, so when we're talking about cold weather and specific gravity, you have to also take into consideration your freezing point of your fluid. So if you've got a specific gravity that's up at 1.30 fully charged, you're gonna be good down to -95 on your freezing point of your electrolyte. But if you go down into one that's 1.10, which is pretty much dead, you're gonna have a freezing point of 19 degrees. So it doesn't take much to freeze a battery. But the biggest thing is if you do add water to that battery in cold weather, you need to remember to charge it immediately. Otherwise, that water doesn't mix with the acid sufficiently and it will freeze and then crack and expand and crack your battery. Wreck it, basically. So when does snow become a problem? Well, we talked a little bit about snow load on your planes. So snow can overload structural limits of wings and tail surfaces, and it doesn't matter whether it's on a big plane or a little plane, a house, well, any kind of other structure. You want to get that snow load off of there. So when we talk airplanes, ideally we would remove those snow accumulations as early as possible. As soon as it stops snowing, get out there and get that snow off of it. Consult the aircraft operating manual for your weight tolerances. If you're going to be out of town, have somebody assigned, sound like a teacher, assigned to come make sure that snow's removed from your airplane and that it's taken care of. You don't want to leave that on. Don't want to leave that on there, as most of you already know. Remove snow promptly to avoid that freeze-thaw damage, because when you're talking about snow load on there, it's going to excessive loss of lift. Obviously, you don't want that weight causing an airplane to lose attitude, and then also your thrust can get decreased, your drag's going to increase with snow on the plane. Anyways, it's never your friend. You don't want that. Don't want it to have a problem because you didn't take care of that snow load. Preheating best practices. So if it's colder than 40 degrees, you need to heat it. Everything needs to be heated up. Your instruments, your engines, your cables. You want to heat that airplane, not just your engines. So you can use those electric preheaters or forced air heaters. There's a little picture of a Sure Start, the Twin Hornet. So there's a cabin heater and also your engine compartment heaters. There's all kinds out there. People make their own. I don't know. My favorite, of course, is on the next slide, but you can't use that in all situations. It's mainly for larger applications. But you want to ensure, regardless of the type of heat that you use, you want to ensure even heat distribution. You want to make sure your cockpit's been preheated. And that's going to help prevent the avionics and instrument failure by warming that cockpit up. Of course, not all of us can afford to take around your best buddy Herm with you, last name Nelson. That's how we survived our career. Those little hardware, it's like summer out there when you fire up this little baby. So anyway, you wanna, but the biggest point for thinking about when you're heating things up is you wanna reduce that engine wear, increase your engine life. That's gonna help you with the ease of starting. It's gonna reduce that chance of frosting those plugs. It's gonna reduce the run-up time that's required during winter operations and save you fuel. It's gonna prevent cylinder scoring. It's gonna ensure proper oil flow, increase safety. And engine manufacturers mandate preheating. Okay, they don't want you going out there and not preheating it. The engine crankcase is made of aluminum. Engine rotating parts are made of steel, and due to that coefficient of thermal expansion, the aluminum crankcase shrinks more than the steel parts that are in it. So, you heat it up, it helps save that from happening. In that picture there on the right's a VTX 400. It's a series of indirect fired heaters. Herman Nelson. Of course, we had the old gas kind originally at FedEx. I was scared to death of those things for years. I caught one on fire. They've improved them a lot. They're all easy to use now. So anyways, when we're talking about safe snow and ice removal, not everybody gets the luxury of an open bucket trump the ice truck. Mark knew how to finagle a little bit so we'd get a little more pressure out of it. We spent a lot of days up in that bucket de-icing those airplanes, but more often than not, I'm gonna be using that snow broom that's in the picture there. But you guys all have your own ways. Not always is a broom feasible. They show that picture of them using a broom. That stuff's stuck on there, that broom's not gonna do anything to it. It's not gonna come off. So having the covers on is probably your first line of defense, keeping that airplane covered, because unless you have it in a hangar, or you can put it in a warm hangar to thaw it out, then you're not gonna have that. You're gonna have to get that off there one way or the other without damaging the aircraft. So you don't wanna use any kind of sharp tools. You use whatever works best for you. Sometimes, like Rocky and I were talking about yesterday, you get out there soon enough, you can take those leaf blowers. My husband has one of them too, sitting right next to Rocky. Take that light snow, those leaf blowers work great. You blow it all out of there. So that's a good line of defense. But so clearing that snow and ice promptly post-flight. Apply those water displacement sprays where you can. Inspect for moisture before storage. And I was talking to Joe yesterday about it. Hinges, your flight control surface hinge areas, those need to be inspected. Make sure you don't have any high ice in those either. So when we're talking about winterizing your aircraft, it's getting really cold out now. You talk about the kind of oil that you're going to use. Are you going to cover it or keep it clear? Your control cables, because of contraction expansion caused by those temperature changes, those control cables need to be properly checked out, adjusted. They say park into the sun, and we're not going to all be facing that way, but if we realistically, right? To help that get that morning sun. But if you are somewhere and you can park into the sun to help reduce some of that snow on there, that'd be great. Preheat it. Take the wheel pants off. Doesn't want to wear those wheel pants. Ice and slush could collect under them and cause the wheels to lock up when you land. Check your engine breather tubes. One of the hazards of winter operations, the engine breather tubes can freeze shut. Don't forget to change your oil. Check on the oil weights with your pilot operating handbook or provided aircraft manual to make sure that you can, in the winter ops, may call for a less viscous oil so that oil can circulate more freely once your engine's starting. Retime your magnetos. Make sure you've got your ignition timing correct, because an improperly timed magneto can make starting harder and can also lead to engine damage. Inspect that cabin heat system. Aircraft equipped with heat exchangers that surround mufflers or other parts of the exhaust system. There's danger of carbon monoxide seeping in that cabin. So always remove the heater shrouds, check for cracks in the exhaust system, and patch or replace those questionable parts. Because defective combustion heaters in twin engine aircraft can also lead to carbon monoxide in the cabin, so you don't want that. Install heat retention devices. If it's recommended by the aircraft manufacturer, install baffles and oil cooler covers when temperatures drop to specified levels. Check your insulation. Inspect insulation of all your lines and hoses, and make sure that your insulation of your tanks and that's for dry sump system. Just inspect your hoses, your hose clamps, your hydraulic fittings and seals. All these areas are places where moisture can get in, and you just want to make sure to help. It's all in an effort to prevent corrosion. Okay, so add air to your tires and struts. Nitrogen is what we used, of course, on the heavies. And even that, when it gets cold here, down around 0, got that north wind blowing, that plane comes in, yeah, it makes a great brake cooler. But at the same time, it runs those air temps down, those pressures down in those tires. Pretty soon you're under service. So you always want to check during cold weather to make sure you have the proper amount of pressure in your tires and everything serviced up. And also in your struts, if that sealant oil on your strut is deteriorated, that strut will not hold air pressure. Okay, and then eventually it puke all its fluid out too. So test, clean, and charge that battery. Inspect your de-icing equipment. If you have de-icing equipment on your aircraft, once a week you should check those boots. On your propellers, you have some de-icing systems that have to be checked. Some of them use alcohol. Make sure your reservoirs, whatever it is you're using in your for de-icing and anti-icing is operational. And I guess one of the last tips I put in here kind of goes with the survival was dress warmly. You know how many times I see the guys outside walking around, they've got their summer jacket on, they're cool, got their hands in their pockets, doing their walk around. It's like 20 or less, and I'm going, where the hell is your jacket? Your parka. You need your parka, you need warm gloves on, because once your hands are cold, you're screwed. You need warm gloves on, you need warm boots on, you need to be dressed like you're gonna spend the rest of the day out there. Because if you're not, then you're not prepared. And that's what I used to tell the guys. I'm dressed like I stay out there all day. My plane breaks, tough tacos. You're out there all day. If you're not dressed for it, your life's gonna be miserable. And anyways, enough of that. Sound like mom. Okay, risk transitioning to outdoors during winter conditions. So those of you who do have the luxury of your airplane gets to live in a nice warm hangar. What about when it's snowing outside and you take it out there, it's all warm? That's not good either, right? So you've got at risk of that snow melting and then refreezing on those surfaces as that snow's coming down. It can cause more problems. You've got things frozen up and won't work. So wipe it down. So if it's snowing outside, get that snow off that warm airplane as fast as you can to minimize that time that you actually spend out on that ramp during preparation. We're almost done. Key takeaways. So reread your aircraft flight manual. Always pay particular attention to the sections on winterization. Okay, if you can keep that aircraft in the hangar, if you're that lucky, especially the night before, make sure that plane, if you can't keep your plane in the hangar, make sure it's covered. Okay, change that engine oil to multi-grade or the manufacturer-approved cold temperature oil. Install a winterization kit to deflect that cold air and keep the cylinders warm. Renew your carbon monoxide detectors and have the system checked for cracks. Turn on the cabin heater to make sure it works. Make sure your pitot covers, static vent plugs, control surface locks, and tie downs are in working order. Do all this stuff before you go. You don't want to get out there and have that stuff broken or not in working order and then be SOL. So confirm your drain holes are clear of dirt and debris to prevent standing water from freezing and causing blockages, and check that carb heat and alternate air inlet, especially before takeoff. It'd be awful to get there and have it not working when you needed it. So find out if your aircraft requires isopropyl alcohol in the fuel for operation at low temperatures. After refueling, let the fuel settle in the tanks, then check it for water again. You should have checked it for water before you put it in there. Check that all your airframe, propeller, and windscreen systems are operating correctly. Check that the inflatable boots inflate properly, especially on the tailplanes. check that the battery is fully charged and your alternator's working properly so that it will charge your battery up. Clean the airframe of mud, slush, and dirt when you can to prevent the buildup of it, and double check your elevator hinges. On a flight day, wear warm clothing and waterproof gloves and hats and footwear, and bring your survival gear. Don't ever leave home without it. And like Bart was saying, that lanyard idea, to pull that forward with you, man, that was a great takeaway from today, I thought. Pack a cold weather parka, heavy blanket, and winter survival kit. Before takeoff, get an up-to-date aviation weather forecast and note any icing warnings. Make sure your route plan is accurate and you have an alternate in case you encounter ice and snow. Always have a contingency plan. In the world of jets, you have triple contingency usually. You guys got one engine, most of you. Take care of it. Okay, avoid those risks. And that is just about it. Are there any questions? Ones that I could answer. Yes?
For desiccant plugs, do you recommend just the uppers or lowers, or is the one better than the other?
That
Location?
is a good question. Now, the aircraft spruce is where I found that. We could look that up. Does anybody in here have anything to add to that? About plugs? Any? Myrtle, you have any experience on that one?
Anybody in here have that?
Anybody? Anybody use them? Okay, so I don't know about upper and lower, but I do know that we have put them in here at the school. We were taught that, and then of course when they turn to pink, you got to replace them. But I would have to look that up. And then if you could, who was that? Where were you at? Who asked me that? I need to get your information. I'll look it up and send it to you. Sound good? Because I don't have that exactly. Yes, Dr. Stewart.
How often do you put skis on in the winter time? Not for you, but for the airplane.
How often do you put
Skis on,
them on before you fly?
preferably, yeah.
Preferably. You mean for practice? Put them on and take them off?
If you're flying to an area where you're not landing on a runway, you're landing on a rural lake that's frozen in the winter, you've got a cabin out in the woods or whatever, it's a good idea to have your skis on rather than tires.
Oh, most certainly, yes. Yes, you put them on before you leave, ideally. And then, I can't tell one short ski flying, I'll go to that question, is when you go to land on those and you have that flat light, be careful because it's not flat. Sometimes you could have snow berms and you can get a little airborne with those skis because you're landing on areas that aren't, right? You guys probably had that happen. What was the other question?
I think Dr. Stewart's point is there's a lot of argument online about, hey, can I land with my tender tires on that lake? How much snow's on it, right? And there's a lot of people that found out the hard way by breaking through at the last minute as they were decelerating. They were good on the crest initially, but then you punch through at the end, or you turn off at a hard pack and punch through, and then you're stuck or you're on your back or whatever. It's a high risk choice to make, right? So skis good, big tires not so good.
Yeah, no, I don't think I would attempt going there at all without being on skis myself. And then it'd be nice to have PIREPs from other people who've already been in there to know how the depth of your snow is. If you're not familiar with the area, I don't think I would go in somewhere. You do a fly around, look at, how do you check for gauging that depth of that snow where you're going into based on previous weather reports? What is a good rule of thumb? Does anybody have that? What's that?
Drag it with skis.
Drag it with skis. Have some, but when you're going out to a remote area where there may not be anybody there, flying out to Egiagig or some of those other places where you're gonna go caribou hunting, you're gonna be relying off other people's reports, or maybe some people in the local area who may live around there. Is that how that works?
If it's a frozen lake, it's a 12-pound bowling ball from 400 feet. If it bounces, you're good to land.
Okay. thanks, you guys. I don't have a lot of experience flying, so you can tell that one. Yeah, Ben, yes.
A question on something that I was shown, and it works well, and I'm just wondering why it works, and I think I might have to figure out, but on a beaver, I was having a little trouble climbing into altitude, getting higher. And I was told to run carburetor heat as I climbed, and then lean it, and it does work better. And I've tried it on several aircraft and found that it works better. And I'm wondering, is it atomizing the fuel more efficiently with the warmer fuel flow? Is that what's going on, or what do you think?
Well, your density's gonna change for your air. so you
Right,
get
right.
less,
That's why I'm leaning it.
and you're leaning it.
Yeah. But I found that it works, on the 985 especially, it works significantly better as you start to get into higher altitudes, especially. Once in a while, to get out of turbulence, Holland Passes, I'll go right over the top of the range, and it's a hard climb in a beaver. And so it works quite well when I'm getting above 8,000, 9,000. And have you ever seen such a thing? Because I've asked every beaver guy I know, I've asked every turbine guy, and they've never heard of it before. But this one guy told me this, and I found it works well. And I was in pattern the other night with my 150, and it was running rough, and I just kept the carb heat on in the pattern, and then brought the mixture back, and it ran beautifully.
There was some, I was reading a little bit more about that, yesterday about the carburetor icing heat.
Because John Allsworth has always said that too, especially on the 0470s, to run partial carb heat, and he's the only person I've ever heard say that.
Partial carb heat, yeah, and that's another one of those, I don't wanna answer it incorrectly, because I don't have a large knowledge base on it, without looking into it further.
Yeah.
But that does sound logical.
We're always advised not to use partial carb heat, but I've never heard anybody say why.
Okay.
I don't know if that was putting us in a target temperature range that would induce icing, or what the purpose is, I don't know.
Is there anybody else in here who has anything to add to that about running carb heat and leaning out?
The only thing I would say about that is, you don't wanna do it if you don't have a carb temperature gauge. That's the issue.
Yeah.
If you need it, if you don't have that gauge, then you're better going full. If you know that you're keeping it out of, the icing range because you've got the temperature gauge, then that's different, then you can use partial safely.
Yeah,
What
and that,
temperature
thank
range
you.
were you in?
And there is a note in here, on carburetor icing, the FAA note of it, said partial throttle, cruiser letdown is the most, right, got that. So the recommended practice is to apply carb heat before reducing power and to use partial power during letdown to prevent icing and overcooling the engine. So did that,
Bring it home.
it's not,
That's standard.
that's just standard.
This was cold. This was
Use full carb heat, yep, I don't have, yes.
I've had experience with different engines. This was a Yamaha engine, multiple Yamaha engines, and they had carburetors, and it was -20,
Yeah.
and I put some heat in them, and they would just run perfect.
Yeah.
But they would not run good at -20, but I found that you had to get that cold before the problem came up.
Well, like you get like Continental 65s, 85s, 75s, I mean, you gotta run carb heat to taxi that up.
Yeah, because
It's just not atomizing that fuel.
it's some with the fuel oil mixture at that temperature, when they get super cold, that somehow they don't wanna run right, and it's gotta be the air fuel mixture.
Yeah.
And when you warm it up a little bit, it gets back in the good range.
So based on temperature and air density, where you're at, so that perfect little sweet spot.
Because the guy that told me, he didn't really know why. He just said it does work better, but he didn't really specify why. He just, I don't know. It's like,
Do this, I can't tell you what.
Volumetric efficiency, I'm just making that up, but I mean, it does probably have to do with that. Anybody else in here have anything they wanna add or any other questions? We had a fun day, there was a lot of valuable
Thank you.
information.